do you remember like the first thing that you encounter in terms of this sort of a mystery or this sort of a, of a happening that made you so fascinated in that, give you the idea in terms of the field that you want to develop yourself in terms of, whether it's physics, whether it's math? Do you remember the first thing that happened and you were like, wow, I really want to understand how is this happening? And I'm really interested in this whole dynamic.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think I can remember the first thing. Mm-hmm. And if there was a first thing, of course there had to have been. I don't remember exactly what that was, mm-hmm. but I do remember many things that, as a child things that would come up, like this one, why is the sky blue? And the first people that were around me didn't really have good answers, or they gave me answers that didn't seem so satisfying. And I'm like, it's also interesting. It's an interesting dynamic because I grew up in a rather extremely religious, sort of like almost like culty religious perspective community and in society. And that was, I realized in fact pretty early on in my life that I was an atheist, but not when I was like 5 years old. And these things still seemed weird to me at like 8 years old, when somebody would say, oh, well, a deity did that, God did that. It's like, well, that was completely unsatisfying to me. And it was only later when I realized that, that I'd been raised in this kind of like high pressure, weird cult environment, that I started to come to terms with, the differences in the way that, the difference between trying to get to an answer and it's okay to not know something and then seek after the answer, versus this is the way things are and don't question them. That was only later when I realized that there was such a powerful way of thinking about the world, and found my own kind of, deep, true perspective instead. And so there were a lot of things like that. And again, I'm not saying that every question that I had about science was answered with God did it, but I was confronted with quite a few sort of capitulations like that, or sort of throwing up their hands. It's like, well, I don't know, but that's beyond our understanding. No, lots of things. Nothing's beyond our understanding. And it's interesting too, because a lot of the discord or the dissonance that happens is that people within religious traditions, and again, it's none of my business what somebody else wants to believe, as long as they're not hurting anybody else with their belief system. It's fine. It's none of my business. But you do have a lot of these people that they love to insist that certain things are true in the face of absolutely no evidence for that thing. And in fact, it's one of the big differences between a sort of religious mindset toward the world and a scientific mindset. Like, because a lot of people will also, defame the sciences. And again, we're getting into sort of a side topic here, but a lot of people within very dogmatic traditions, and it doesn't have to be religious. It can just be like very, very sort of like old fashioned conservative mindsets. They denigrate science as a concept because they like to say, oh, well, science is just another form of religion. You just have to believe. You're just believing that's true, man. It's like, you've never seen the Higgs boson, man. You're just believing it's true. That is completely wrong. It's like so wrong that it's hard to put into words, because science has absolutely nothing to do with belief. It doesn't, because anytime you posit belief, you're basically built into the concept of belief as a choice. I can choose to believe something, right? And that's the concept of belief, right? It's like if you see two people outside of a church, right? And one of them says, like, well, I believe God is there's a bearded white man that lives outside the universe that looks at you. And the other person says, well, I don't believe that. They both have a choice, right? They choose to believe that. The other person's like, well, I choose not to believe you. But with data, with science, you don't have a choice. Seriously, there's nothing to choose, because we have, again, this is also a very interesting thing. I use my own field as an example, but it applies to all the sciences. When we discovered this particle, the Higgs boson particle in 2012, hooray, good for me and my colleagues. Like, I don't know, 6,000 people discovered the Higgs boson. So it's not as impressive as it sounds. But it is impressive in another way. So because of that community discovery, but when we published the paper, right, the thing we said was not, we believe we've discovered the Higgs boson. Instead, what we said is, we see an effect in our data that is inconsistent with the absence of a new discovery. Therefore, we conclude that we have seen something new that has not been, we have observed something new that has not been seen before. There's nothing to disagree with there. I mean, like, as you know, with science, the whole point is that you put in all of your uncertainties, you label them, you make sure you understand them. And if you don't understand your uncertainties, you don't publish the paper. And once everything is out there, that's it. The data are the data, full stop. There's nothing to either believe in or disbelieve. And you never assent to something in science. You never assent to the truth of something in the absence of evidence for it. That would make no sense. It's the opposite of what science does. But that's, if you think about it, that's exactly what religious traditions require of you, at least major religious traditions, right? They require this concept of faith, right? And you are necessarily required to believe, to assent to the reality of some claim deliberately in the absence of evidence for it, because that's where faith comes in. Because if you had evidence, you wouldn't need faith. So that's where that's why these two things are. It's propagandistic for people to say, oh, well, science is just another form of religion. It couldn't be farther from the truth. So this is the long way of saying that, there were a lot of things when I was growing up that would fall into that basket of things. People would just sort of try to evade the answer. But, of course, we had, it was the modern age. I had libraries, I had places I could go for real information, and I had real science teachers and things like that. It's, I don't want to give the impression that I was, raised in like on the moon or something like that, where there was no access to anything. So that's what I would do. I would seek out these things on myself. I really was that crazy kid who would go to the library and spend hours looking through the encyclopedia and finding other weird books and comparing things. Specific things, no. I do remember though, as a kid, and it's kind of a funny thing related to what I do now, right? Because, here at CERN, at particle physics in general, as a discipline, really what we're trying to do is study how the smallest possible things in the universe construct the universe itself. Right. So that's really what we're doing. We're trying to understand what are the smallest, most elementary things that the universe has in store for us, and the building blocks, and how do those come together in various ways through interactions and forces, et cetera, to lead to the universe that we observe now and that we live in. And so I remember as a kid, I think like any of us, but I remember, playing with my bread or food as a tiny child. I was trying to think about how small could I go. I thought it was so weird that you start with the bread. It was just one moment that kind of hit me, where I was a baby, and then I got into a toddler and then an adult. I was like it's a bread, but then I can cut it down to a crumb. And then how small? What's the smallest crumb? Mom, what's the smallest crumb? And she's like, oh, well, if you get small enough, there's something called molecules. And that was way over my head, right? I was too small. But I was like, oh, molecules or something, So this is one of these things where, again, I say that physics chooses you. You don't really choose physics, because, and then once I got older, I get into the sciences, get into classes, right? Of course, you start learning science, proper science. And again, I actually went to public schools. Don't worry, I wasn't actually, like I said, I wasn't raised in a religious cult on the moon or something like that. I went to real schools, but they start teaching the different sciences, right? And I was fascinated by all the sciences. And of course, I was fascinated by the art schools as well, or the art classes as well. But all the sciences are amazing, and so geology, incredible. I loved everything about it. Archaeology, who doesn't love that? Marine biology, everybody loves marine biology. I was fascinated by all these different things, but the physicist is always the one who asks the question, the how and why question behind the how and why. And you want to get deeper and deeper and deeper. So if you're if you're a zoologist, you learn about, or a biologist, you learn about, human biology or just animal, biology in general. You're like, wow, this is fascinating. I got to study this for the rest of my life. And that's great. And then if you're, but if you're the physicist, you're like, what's below that? What's underneath biology? And eventually you'll get down and say, okay, well, there's genomics, and there's but what's below that? It's okay, well, you get down into chemistry. Chemistry is this, how these things fit together and the different patterns that they make these effects and these kinds of things. And that's great. But the physicist goes, okay, but what's below that? Because it's well, okay, these things, these molecules are made up of different atoms, and the atoms have protons and electrons. It's what's below, what's smaller than an electron? And the answer is, we don't know. We think an electron has zero volume. That's where I want to be, right? I want to be right at the edge. And then you ask, can I cut a proton? And it turns out we can actually cut what's inside of a proton. There's little quarks and gluons inside there. And then you ask, can I cut a quark? The answer is, as far as we know, no. This is also a zero volume thing. And that's exactly where I want to be, because these are the big questions. Another thing that these are the kind of edges of human knowledge, right? Another one that was always interesting to me was, of course, black holes. I mean, black holes blew my mind when I was a small kid, reading these science books that would do these great things. Very often, like the books that I was reading, the picture books at the time, they would have about the planets, right? About space. It's like a book about space, for like a 10-year-old kid or an 8-year-old kid or something like that. I was probably reading it when I was 4, but no. You had the book, about space, and it would go through the Earth is like this, and there'd be some cutaway, and it would show, the magma and things, and it's like, and then there's other planets in the solar system, and the sun is like this, and then you get to bigger and bigger things and galaxies, and then they start talking about more speculative things, and there'd be like one page about black holes, and it was this terrifying object where you're like, what is this thing? And they're like, very little is known about black holes because no one has ever traveled to one yet. And you're like, whoa, I got it. What's like, but it's a place where gravity is completely, it's a completely gravitationally collapsed object. And I'm like, what does that mean? And it sucks in anything that gets too close to it, and you're like, whoa. So, and that's fascinating, right? I mean, this is exactly the thing where it's saying on the page, there's something we have observed. We don't know what it is yet. That's so wonderful. And that's how, of course, as you know, that's what science does. We love these spaces of ambiguity, spaces of unknown things where we want to dive in to try to find an answer, and that's what physics is. Especially physics is wonderful because I don't really agree with who was it, Rutherford or somebody else who said, all of the science is either physics or stamp collecting, whatever that was. I don't agree with that. I think the other sciences, of course, are really fantastic, but physics definitely is the one, where you reach this very edge of our knowledge, and you're just like, oh, okay. And so you're not like really interested in just describing how things happen. You're looking for a search for mechanisms as to explain how and why different phenomena occur. So that's really what physics is. And that's, supremely satisfying, supremely wonderful. And we love these ambiguous places. And, we maybe on a personal level, each individual scientist, physicist is a person, right? So we have, desires, and, of course it's fun to discover something, and it's fun to be right. But really at the end of the day, rationally, intellectually that we're all searching for the same thing. And in fact, this can be a very long slog. This can be, I like to say that my field, especially the experimental part, because these are such enormous experiments that take a long time to plan and execute. It's a marathon. It's not a sprint. And so if somebody's, an acquaintance I haven't seen for like a year or something like that, I see them again. It's like, oh yeah, what's new? It's like, oh yeah, so what are the new discoveries at CERN? I'm like, I haven't seen you for only 1 year. You think we're just like, we're a factory to churn out discoveries? That's not how science works. So